Hello everyone and welcome to week 8. This week's facilitated seminar is all about effective learning in museums and heritage sites. It's being led by myself, Rachel Meyer, and Sydney Triggs, and we're going to be analyzing the 2014 article by Laura Jane Smith called Visitor Emotion, Effect, and Registers of Engagement at Museums and Heritage Sites. So before we get started, I thought we'd take a look at who Laura Jane Smith is. She's actually quite the interesting character. She is the director of the Center of Heritage and Museum Studies and head of the School of Archaeology and Anthropology at the Australian National University. Her research interests involve heritage, museums, and effective learning, perfect for this week. And she claims that there is no such thing as heritage in her 2000 work, Uses of Heritage. Smith's article is a case study and analysis on the issues surrounding effective and aesthetic learning. Her thesis revolves around the idea of visitor engagement at an effective level, analyzing visitor emotion and motivation and the connection to perspectives on heritage memory. Her research questions sought to answer the types and ranges of responses to museums and the messages that visitors are taking away on history and heritage. She found, as many of the authors that we are looking at this week, that there is a lack of research surrounding the effectual experience for visitors and its significance as a means for learning in informal environments. Now, her case study and the arguments that she presents are based on the idea that heritage sites and museums are places for visitors to construct their personal idea of heritage, find a sense of belonging, and legitimize the past and reinforce these concepts of identity. On page 125, she notes that museum collections, heritage sites, or other items and places normally identified as heritage are not in and of themselves heritage, but rather cultural tools that are utilized in an active performance of heritage creation in which remembering and memory making occurs. So for instance, in her case study, Smith interviews a woman after a visit to a civil rights exhibit, and she notes that the visitor was using the museum to remember and commemorate her own experiences in the civil rights movement. And with this remembering came a reinforcement of her political and social values. So as such, her research found that the effective learning occurring directly corresponded to the visitor's level of engagement. So clearly, Smith feels that the effectual experience is key in an informal learning space, and many of the authors that we're studying this week would agree. So for instance, in his 2005 work, Alsop notes that emotion is, again, key, where education is more than the memorization of a curriculum subject. It is the beauty and delight of becoming absorbed, seeing the world in different ways with different possibilities. It's about the challenge, surprise, desire, joy, expectation, and mystery, the thrill of discovering oneself in relation to new ideas and contexts. So the idea of emotion is really at the heart of Smith's case study, where she defines learning as effective learning. So emotion and effective based, how a visitor makes sense of a topic based on their emotions, memories, and values. And again, this is explored in other readings this week, including Meyer's and Bergelin's work from 2004, where they note that the affective domain includes emotions, moods, sentiments, and affective traits, all of which combine an often implicit evaluative judgment, whether that's good or bad, with a feeling.
Hi, this is Sydney speaking now, and I'm going to go over the rest of Smith's study. So just to start with participants, this study was based on 2,000 interviews from individuals and groups of visitors. The heritage and cultural institutions that the interviews were done at were located in both the USA and Australia between 2010 and 2014. And this study was also the study built upon existing projects that were started in England in prior years. So in terms of methodology, basically the study consisted of interviews that were based on 12 open-ended core questions for the interviewees to answer. There were some additional questions asked depending on the specific scenario or cultural heritage institution. The semi-structured interviews that were conducted were sort of aimed at being more individual. However, in some cases, people preferred to be interviewed in groups if they'd visited the institution in group, for example. So some of the interviews were conducted in group settings as well. And also some demographic questions were asked, such as age, gender, occupation, distance traveled to the institution, and that kind of thing. So, in terms of analysis and results, Laura Jane Smith's study sort of focused on two key issues to do with emotion and engagement to do with heritage and cultural institutions. The first key issue is engagement, and the second key issue is reinforcement. In our presentation, we're going to be going over those terms and what they mean in relation to the study a little bit more closely. But just for the time being, engagement refers to the attraction of someone's interest or attention in something. So to what extent are you engaged? This could be a surface engagement or a more profound engagement, depending on the scenario. And reinforcement. So reinforcement refers to a strengthening or affirmation of a belief or behavior. So if you already believe something and you, for example, read a book on that same topic, your initial belief will be strengthened or reinforced by having that interaction. So to go over a bit more closely the key issue of engagement in relation to the study, Laura Jane Smith found that people engage differently with different aspects of history. So basically all this means is depending on your identity and how you exist in the world, different things in history will mean more to you. Maybe you have more awareness, maybe you have no awareness, but this is highly personal. So this will differ a lot between individual visitors. And she also comments that various sites will initiate personal and variable levels of visitor engagement. So as I said, we can't really tell which sites will have which effects on which people because people bring such diverse experiences into their visits. However, Smith gets a little bit more into the idea of engagement, shallow versus deep engagement. So she says that even shallow engagement can do important political and cultural work. I gave the example of social media or awareness raising. So shallow engagement would be something a little more shallow, not as profound. Maybe you just like looking at something, maybe it's a flashy image or a joke, but it still engages people, it still draws them in, and it still shares information about a historical event or exhibit or something like that. She also comments that deep engagement can be very emotional, which can take away from critical insight. So basically, even if we are highly engaged in something emotionally, or it means a lot to us, or we're learning a lot, we might not necessarily interact with it in a critical way if our engagement is too deep, because it will affect us too emotionally or profoundly to perhaps have such rational ideas about it. So basically her comments in this section come from the debate between shallow and deep engagement. She talks about that in the world of museums, often there's a bias towards deep engagement, and shallow engagement is seen as a little bit less or not as desirable. However, in this study, she talks about how deep engagement and shallow engagement, well, one isn't necessarily more valuable than the other because they both involve engagement in some way, and they're all engaging people in a topic, and that's the most important thing by having an exhibit on that topic. So just to unpack the key issue of reinforcement a little bit more in relation to the study, is Laura Jane Smith comments that interviewees from different sites and different countries talked about their visits reinforcing what they already know, feel, and believe significantly more than learning new things. So basically the finding here, which is quite interesting, is that often people already know or feel something and they like to go to an institution to strengthen or reinforce that belief they already have rather than learning a totally new topic. Not that no new learning occurs in that situation, but that might not be the focus of people, especially emotionally speaking. It's interesting because she gives examples of Museum of Labor, immigration, indigenous histories, and civil rights, as well as consensus narratives. So basically what she means by this is institutions with minority narratives are very important sites for reinforcement of people's narratives, but this kind of phenomenon happens as much to do with majority narratives. So, for example, different people could look at the same exhibit, but depending on their identity, they might have their own beliefs reinforced in different ways, and they'll see the exhibit through their personal lenses. So this is something important to keep in mind, because even if an exhibit is sort of focused in a certain way, it doesn't mean that we can predict how people will interact with it emotionally. Another thing that Smith talks about, which I just wanted to mention in terms of analysis, is the role that cultural and heritage institutions can play in socialization and acculturation. So they can act as cultural tools, for example, passing on familial memory, knowledge, and more general memory. And I thought while I was reading this that this could be seen as a form of oral history. So, for example, if parents wanted to teach their children about something they lived through and there was a cultural site related to that, they could take their children there and use that as a tool of passing on the memory. Certain visits can also be statements of belonging or viewed as statements of belonging. So some exhibits may be geared more towards a particular ethnic, cultural, national, or class group, depending on what the exhibit is and depending on how people feel about it emotionally. And another thing that Laura Jane Smith mentioned, which was interesting thinking about this in relation to Canada, is new identities. So people that may immigrate to a new place or move to a new place may go to a cultural or heritage exhibit in order to familiarize themselves, in order to learn more about the culture, share with their family, and so on. So just to talk about some conclusions, Laura Jane Smith comes to some broad conclusions, and she also analyzes a little bit about why it's important to think about the effect of emotion and engagement in visitors in relation to modern institutions. So the one point she really stresses in the conclusion is that we really need to start unpacking this field that is not researched very much, to do with the emotional aspect of how visitors interpret heritage and cultural institutions. Of course, she mentions that emotional relationships with these institutions can be positive or negative, depending on your identity and how you interpret things. This also relates to the politics of recognition versus non-recognition. So depending on the identity of the visitor, they may feel that their identity or their selves are recognized within the exhibit, or perhaps for more minority narratives, it may be frustrating or upsetting or hurtful if they do not feel recognized in those exhibits, or they do not feel accurately recognized or portrayed. So she ends by saying that these institutions can often and hopefully act as safe spaces to explore complex issues, but this is only for some, and this is something that we really need to work towards, is making heritage and cultural institutions safe spaces for all to explore complex issues. And a way to achieve this is learning more about emotional aspects. The last thing that I will say, which are also some other conclusions that Laura Jane Smith makes, is the use of the past and the present. Sorry. So basically, one of the most important reasons to think about emotional reactions to cultural and heritage institutions is how this relates to people's identities. So the identities that we hold as people are very much active and important in our present lives, but they're very much based on the past and what we've lived through and what our families have lived through and what our ancestors have lived through. So this is relevant to, for example, unpacking contemporary social and political issues, personal, ethnic, and national identities, and more personal identities based on past and present. So these are very complex issues and complex ideas that will be helped in unpacking by understanding the emotional aspect of how we interact with identity and how we interact with our heritage as people.
So we would like to pass the torch along to you with 3 discussion questions. Firstly, do you agree or disagree with Smith's treatment of the key issue of engagement? Should deep engagement be a priority, or should any of maximization of engagement be a priority? And of course, why or why not? If it helps, this also relates to the 1998 Falk reading this week and the debate on visitor education versus entertainment. We'd also like to know if you think institutions of informal education should be striving toward the reinforcement of consensus narratives or minority narratives in a contemporary context. And finally, Smith's case study found that museums reaffirm visitors' beliefs and values. So how do we, as educators, reconcile inconsistent memories? People have different feelings and attitudes surrounding historical periods and events based on their personal experiences. For instance, the memories of war are very different depending on what side you were on. So how do we, as educators, reconcile inconsistent memories? Thank you again for listening, and should you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask Sydney or myself. Thank you again.